Chris Keene. I'm currently the CEO of a company called Gigster. I've been CEO for 2 weeks, so expect appropriate level of understanding about the business. But Gigster is a company that does on-demand software development using teams of freelancers and then an automation workflow. So where, say, WeWork or an Upwork might give you a single person to do a single thing, Gigster is able to build mostly web and mobile applications with an entire team and do that at scale. And so for most of our customers, the Fortune 500 companies that have big lists of innovation projects, they're typically too small to give to somebody like an Accenture, and there's too many of them to go farm them out to individual companies. So for companies like Harley-Davidson and Canon and other companies, we'll do 10 or 20 projects a year. And that's basically the company. My background is I was math and computer science undergraduate, and then tried to start a company and failed, and so went back to business school and worked for McKinsey for a while, and then started a company and succeeded, took it public in the real-time analytics space, and then had another company that I sold to VMware, and then I ended up at Gigster. So that's my story.
Well, I did not start a company, but I'm Meredith Brown. I'm with Salesforce. I started my career in consulting, which is kind of an interesting place to be. And I was a product manager before there really was the title product manager. You know, business analyst, business lead, help figure out these requirements and pass them off to the engineer. So did that for a while, and then spent many years at Blue Shield in California, where they were transitioning from a lot of paper-based processes and bringing things online. That was really fascinating time and really interesting projects. And then finally, there was a title called project or product management out there in the field, and was able to translate that and moved to a couple startups, and then landed at Salesforce, where I've been for about 5 years.
My name is Tunguz. I'm a partner at Redpoint. Redpoint's an early stage venture capital fund. We invest in consumer and enterprise companies. We're lucky enough to be investors in Gigster. We're investors in companies like Stripe and Twilio and Zendesk and Looker, a bunch of others. I've been at Redpoint for about 10 years. Before joining Redpoint, I was a product manager at Google. I managed 2 different ads products there, about $400 million a year in revenue. And before that, I was a software engineer at a startup that went public. And before that, I started a company that failed.
And you start a company and have it fail.
And Tomasz was sharing us your anecdote on how you're connected to AWIP and why you're inspired by this mission. Is so first of all, I think you're the audience about that.
Sure, yeah. So I joined Google. Well, I really wanted to be a product manager because I'm sure, as all of you do, you love being at the intersection of technology and business. And I really wanted to work for Google, but my GPA was a 3.3, and they were only hiring product managers with 3.5 GPAs. So I got a job as an account manager, and my goal inside of Google the first year was to infiltrate the product management organization and become a product manager. And so I did that over the first 12 months. I worked a lot with different product managers, tried to build a relationship. And the 2 big breaks in my careers actually came from women in product. So my first big break was when Marissa Meyer hired me to become an APM at Google. And she gave me a product in the ads team. And then my second big break was when Susan Wojcicki gave me an assignment to manage a multi-$100 million a year project, reporting directly to the C-suite. And so I feel an enormous sense of desire to give back, just because of the doors that were open for me.
Cool. And just so that we understand from the panel and myself, understand what the audience makeup is, can you raise your hand if you are a founder of the company? So a few founders up here. And then how many of you are product functions? Cool. And just also understanding like stage of the company, like how many folks are like early stage, seed, Series A, and then how many of you are later stage? Okay.
I was like today or before. I could raise.
How would you define later stage?
You have more than one payroll's cash in a day.
Well, hopefully that's all of us. Cool. So let's dive right in and talk about global audiences. Chris, so previously you were CEO at Teridion. I read that it's an Israeli startup that offers multi-cloud CDNs. So you're leading a foreign company that's trying to go to market in the US. Do you think that angle is interesting for folks here as we think about taking our products global? What's like a unique angle that comes from like the other angle?
Oh, wow. Yeah, that was super interesting experience, and that. So I should also say I spent 2 years in Germany working for Hewlett Packard and McKinsey, and I spent a year in Paris as a professor at INSEAD teaching entrepreneurship. So I speak French and German, but not any Israeli, and it's a really different culture for me anyway. It felt different. In many ways because it seems so similar, but it's not. One of the most interesting things we did is we had a kind of a person who could kind of code switch, meet with the executive team and say, okay, this is what, and effectively it was, I think her perspective was, people tend to have strategies and long-term plans here and kind of believe that you can invest resources over time and get results. And just as a gross generalization, people in Israel are much more about like making it happen right now and being very, very tactical and kind of getting to strategy through the tactics. And so you can really get sideways with that. And I do think that the product management function to me is kind of the code switching function in the company. Or to put it differently, most startups have an excess of IQ and not an abundance of EQ. And there might be a relationship between excess of testosterone and other things, but there's kind of like these, they come prepackaged a certain way, and I think the product management function is the one that's trying to, I think the example that was given was really trying to authentically reflect what's needed in the marketplace and not sell it for proxies. And everything that you can do to understand those different worlds, I think, makes you stronger in thinking about a product strategy.
And Meredith, so you've worked in a variety of industries, from insurance and editorial and marketing. How do you think about particular industries and how that relates to global audiences?
Yeah, I mean, I think the big role that we play as product managers is not just building the project or the product, but thinking about who's going to consume it and how we're going to support it. So for example, when I was at Blue Shield, we were building these products, but we had whole customer service organizations in the Philippines and India who had to help our consumers work through these products. So we spent a lot of time in Manila teaching them about the product, and it's a very different culture and how they think about talking to customers. It's very customer first, which is great, but they don't want to ever say no. So we always had a hard time, well, where are we with this launch? Are we close? And they're like, yes, we're close, but we weren't. And so that was sort of the big lesson learned working in that market. It's just kind of how do you execute and how do you work through those cultural differences. And that was, the support functions are just so huge. Whereas now you fast forward to looking at the products that I manage at Salesforce, it's a SaaS business. It's so important that we understand who's actually going to go sell and support those customers, because we can't just put it into market and expect that it's just going to naturally get adopted and going to succeed. So we have to be really strategic about where do we have the right distribution channels, where do we have the right support functions to make our customers successful. And obviously different markets are going to have different strengths.
And so Tomasz, being on the investor side of things, what's your advice for founders that are looking to grow their products, whether it's in the US or internationally, at any point?
Yeah, I've seen lots of different crazy things happen. I can give you a couple of stories from Google. One of the stories, when I was at Google, we were working with a YouTube team, and in Thailand it is illegal to criticize the king. And there was a video of somebody criticizing the king in Thailand, and so our account manager in Thailand was arrested. And when Google also had a social network in Brazil that was founded by a Turkish guy named Orkut, which was like the biggest social network in Brazil at the time. The entire Orkut team was actually imprisoned as well when we were there because photographs of animal cruelty were illegal. And so there turned out to be, unfortunately, some images of animal cruelty. And then the last story was there, I was responsible for localizing AdSense in different languages. And we ran into a geopolitical issue because I think it was the Serbs and the Croats were fighting. And we had to release both localizations at exactly the same time. Otherwise, there was going to be a lot of political issues. So it's kind of funny how like you can run into, we ran into a lot of different political issues with Google, there were like issues with Google Maps, and all this kind of stuff. So I think the most important thing is cultural sensitivity, which is what you were talking about. Both of you actually were talking about the differences in culture. So I think that's one really critical component, is just really understanding the environment that you're operating in. And I think one of the mistakes that startups often make is they don't necessarily hire somebody from the geography in order to start the office or start the initiative. Even in localization, I work with a machine translation company. You talk to any head of localization, their biggest fear is that somebody publishes an offensive localization, something where a pun or a turn of phrase is translated from one language to another that actually turns out to be. And so that's really important. So cultural sensitivity, I think, is one. I think that the second major issue or kind of question that comes up for early and mid-stage companies is when to go into a new geography. And there's always a tension between a board and the executive team about when to expand. And typically the conversation is the executive management team really would like to expand because it's a whole new geography. There's a lot of revenue opportunity. And the board's reticence is predicated upon a fear of stretching the company's assets and resources too thin and going too broad too fast. And what I've found is there are lots of really inexpensive ways to test whether or not a geography is ready for expansion. At Zendesk, where we were investors, what they would do is that they would actually publish, they would spend a material amount of ad spend before they ever put somebody on the ground, just to kind of lay the market, see whether or not the inbound channels were actually successful. And if then there was enough pipeline to staff and feed an account executive or a sales team, that's when they would deploy. I think that's a really capital efficient way of running a low cost experiment to understand whether that geography is viable. The other way of doing it is, Zendesk in Brazil had about 1,000 customers before they actually ever put down a salesperson. And so that's a really good geography to expand to. It doesn't take a whole lot of intellect to figure that out.
And so Meredith and Chris, we'd love to hear from your perspective. When should companies, maybe based on personal experiences or what you see, when should companies or even products think about expanding global penetration, or should they just double down on the US market?
Well, I think it's easy to put a product out in market and get some early adoption. I mean, if you have good localization, translation, if you have a good platform, which I think at Salesforce we do. So it's easy to get it there, but then how do you get it to take off? Like your example of well, you got a couple thousand users are in Brazil, that's great, but then do you keep going? Do you, and I think we found that in a couple markets where, I work on a marketing automation solution, and we hadn't even translated all of the product to Japanese, and we put it in the Japanese market, and they were just going crazy for it. We're so much interest in marketing automation. It was so unexpected. And so we just kept going at it, and then we translated more of the product, and we put a sales team out there. So it was really interesting to see just what happens more virally, and then be able to respond as well. That was something that we learned along the way.
I'm a big believer in focus and really getting the product market fit right. And really having people that you can talk to and have real relationships with who you feel like, so customer satisfaction to me is kind of squishy. I like to, and it's also highly manipulable and all those things. So I'd like to really understand how we change the business, and usually the proxy that I use is how many people did we get promoted? So it's a really great thing to say, these people adopted our product and now they're leading their organizations. They've been recognized by their organization as having made a material impact. And it's kind of a weird proxy, but if you got somebody promoted, that the company really appreciates what they did. And all of those things become harder and more diffuse the bigger net you cast in the world. And it gets harder and harder to even just talk to people about what you're doing for them. So I really like the idea of running cheap experiments. Even in the US, so I'm at Gigster, and this is maybe sharing a little bit, but the company started out trying to sell kind of low-end, one-off gigs, projects to local companies, which is a hugely competitive market. There's 479,000 systems integrators in the United States, just in case you don't know. So I keep on going around to people and saying, it's really hard on a one-off basis to win in that game, whereas we really win well at scale. But that scale doesn't exist here in the West. It exists on the East. And Silicon Valley companies oftentimes try and expand here, where vendors really don't want to buy from other vendors that much because they all think they're smarter than everybody else. But on the East Coast, they're doing real and important things, and so they're happy to buy. And so, in some ways, I would say not so much about expanding internationally, but it is important for companies, particularly small companies, to think very hard about where they think their market is physically, and really put enough effort into that. That's the expression, put all your eggs in one basket and then watch that basket. So that's kind of my philosophy.
And so, as we think about global consumer and enterprise brands, some companies just offer the exact same product. It's just a localized copy. It's the same product everywhere in the world, but different language. Versus some companies launch a product that's very unique to just this market, like a specific social network for this country, or a specific marketing automation feature for this particular country. How do you guys determine whether or not a product or a company should have something more than just localization?
I can take that one just because everyone here probably knows about GDPR. So I mean, in marketing automation, obviously that's a big deal. And so as we think about what we need to do to support organizations that have customers in those regions where they're affected by, we have to think about features that are going to support them in a much deeper way. So that's one example that definitely comes to mind for the products that I manage.
I think there's almost never a scenario where you develop a product for a country unless that country's market is absolutely enormous, in which case that should be your only product. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I think like when I was at Pinterest, China was always a big topic. And China required a very specific angle at it that we said, well, we're either going to really double down on it and try to win that market or not at all. And then we actually decided, let's not do it at all, just because I've lived in China for a few years, and there are very, very few multinational companies that have succeeded in China as a leader. A lot of folks have done second and third place, but inevitably the industry kind of shifts towards a lot of domestic protections within China as well. So India is also another one that comes up very often, having very strong domestic players as well. Cool. So how do you guys think about segmenting the market? So I think, Chris, you mentioned like even in the US, did not think about just US as a whole and East Coast and West Coast, or globally as we think about EMEA or Asia, or do you segment it by cultural norms and bucket? So a lot of cases like Australia and UK is bundled together. What do you think for the audience makes sense as you think about the world and how to segment?
I have the microphone.
The mic.
Here we go. So I think it really depends on the industry. I worked in the online advertising industry for a while, and the online advertising industry has this funny segmentation, which is, like you said, there's the US, then English-speaking countries, then Japan. And Japan is a completely different go-to-market than any other country. Basically, if you go into the advertising world in Japan, the only way you can go in is to partnering with one of 4 major agencies. Otherwise, you have no shot. And so I think every industry is going to be slightly different. What we see if we change industries for a second, look at the SaaS space, the way I see lots of early stage and mid stage SaaS companies expand is initially in the US, then Australia and the UK, and then in Europe and Germany actually for some reason seems to be a really strong market for lots of different SaaS companies, even with the GDPR regulations, which is surprising. And then they go into APAC. And typically when you start moving into APAC, that's when people go through channels, or Europe. So that's when you sell through somebody else. And you really need to get to a particular scale, say probably $20 million in annual recurring revenue before a channel partner will start to take you seriously. And that's really because if you can't sell your product successfully, it's really difficult to teach somebody else to sell your product really effectively.
Yeah, I mean, I think definitely in the SaaS model, it's all about distribution. So where you'd be able to build the market, where you can build sales and support, and how you're going to make your customers successful. So once you have a great product domestically, I think that's why we see a lot of companies go to the UK, go to Australia, go to Europe, because it's easier to build up those competencies. And I think that's probably the exact model that Salesforce went through too, and then out to APAC, and now trying to expand into Latin America. So there's probably a reason for that, right? Because it is really important that those support functions are out there, and that your customers can be successful with your products.
Okay.
And what about within the US? I mean, I find it fascinating as a reference to think about Silicon Valley not as representative of the entire US. Do you guys think, like in Salesforce case, does that matter? Is there coastal things or urban?
Not so much that, is more around company size, right? So the way that you build a product in the SMB space versus mid-market, that's going to fundamentally change your product strategy. Enterprise customers just have different needs than a 5-person startup. So domestically, we definitely tend to think about it more from that perspective. But I do have one observation kind of on the flip side around building products in different regions. Just because I have a team here in San Francisco, I have one in Atlanta, and then one in Tel Aviv, and just sort of like the cultural differences of building product across these areas. I mean, we had to really kind of teach the teams like, hey, in Atlanta, they're kind of smile and say yes, but they really don't like what you're saying. And then, the people in Tel Aviv, they're going to tell you straight up, this is a stupid idea, and we all need to be able to get along and be able to work through it. And I think it goes back to what Tatiana was saying. So that's the other thing that I think is really interesting about building products across different cultures and different regions.
Yeah, I think, it does come back to really trying to understand what the win is for the customer. Gigster's kind of interesting because we offer the ability to build these beautiful web experiences for relatively small amounts of money, $250,000 to $500,000. In the Bay Area, that's not really all that unusual. There's lots of people building web apps, but so many of our biggest customers like Harley-Davidson and Canon are located in regions where it's hard to get those kinds of people. And I had breakfast, I was at the Andreessen Summit this week and had breakfast with their AI group, and the biggest question that they had on that group is how do you get machine learning people? One of our answers is, well, we've got a partnership with Udacity where they can get machine learning, and then we can put them into freelance jobs and basically rate them kind of like Lyft and Uber drivers, and then kind of get them up to speed. And so kind of trying to figure out how to solve what particular problems do they have in different regions and based on their industries. Really understanding that, it gets back to, again, really understanding specific customers and specific customer challenges and trying to cluster them based on what are the things that they're really struggling with that they can't get done.
So Meredith, you talked about like just B2B sales cycles. Like, how does functions like sales and marketing funnels, how does that impact your priorities in building a global roadmap?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was funny, we talked about this earlier, how the sales folks, they're the ones who think they know what you should build, and say, oh, you want to expand into EMEA, let me tell you what all of our European customers need. And I think that's an interesting data point. It's not what we pivot on. But it also is an inflection point to say, okay, well, there's something there thematically. Maybe I need to get out into market more. Maybe my team needs to be there to really uncover these themes and hear it firsthand. So I always take those as themes, like sort of like, okay, maybe we'll dig into that if I keep hearing this anecdote, and we'll put people out in market. But the reality is they are talking to customers, so you don't want to ignore them. And as they tell us feedback around how they need to grow the business, I think we do need to listen to them, because at the end of the day, we are accountable for making sure our products are successful. So we don't want to discount them, but I do like Tatiana's point, is it's not the only input. It's just might send you in some direction, just where the opportunities are.
concept that you have to that, which is just that, another mantra that I like is I think everybody's in sales. Everybody's in the job of making the salespeople successful. And all salespeople are not the same. There's usually a few really great salespeople and the reason they're really great is they really understand their customers. And sometimes they over-rotate on the specifics of their customers, but I think figuring out, it's not just taking all of this input from different salespeople and then kind of tallying it and doing statistical analysis. It's knowing which salespeople are successful, having a sense of why they're successful, and glomming on to the ones that really get, because they're trying to do what you're trying to do. They're trying to get close to their customer and figure out what matters to them. So those people, I think, really are worth trying to figure out. And in some ways, in my own kind of twisted way of this, is your job in product is to build a product that makes your best sellers even more successful. And another aspiration that I have is if you do your job right, then even the middle of the road sellers will be going to club every year because your product kind of encodes the best knowledge and thinking about what customers really need.
So just to close out, can you guys give like concrete examples of just key insights about a culture that's different from what we're used to here, and how that affected your product decisions for the global audience?
It seems like you might have some good examples.
Yeah, I have one. So when I was a product manager at Google, we did an around the world trip. And we went to Japan, we went to Tokyo, Beijing, Bangkok, 3 cities in India and Israel. And we went to study, this was in 2008, and we went to study how different people in those different geographies use the internet. And Japan was awesome. I mean, anybody who hasn't been to Japan would realize it's such a different culture, but the place that blew me away was China. I had never realized how, if you're a Chinese speaker, how you use a keyboard. Right? Like in the US, we have what a 27-letter alphabet. We use a QWERTY keyboard, but I had taken Chinese in college, and Chinese characters are complicated. So does anyone know how you use how do you type in if you want to type Chinese on a keyboard? So does anyone know?
Chinese.
You're Chinese. Obviously, no. How do you do it?
Just by pinyin, which is the English alphabet. It's just the same, but we do have other types of inputs that it's really complicated and only Chinese can do it. It's by learning the exact character and how they will combine back into parts. And I learned it when I was a kid, and I still using it, and they are not expired yet, but new generation, they don't know how to use it.
Yeah. So I would watch these people using the phone, and you have this keyboard which has like different components of the character.
Yes.
And when I took Chinese, my Chinese professor told me I needed to know about there are roughly 40,000 characters. I need to know about 5,000 to 10,000 characters to be able to read a newspaper, which is an enormous amount of characters. You can imagine, like, if you're learning, you want to type an SMS to somebody, your knowledge of these characters has to be, and so there's this thing called an IME editor where you kind of like draw the box and draw the box inside the box, and then we make a suggestion, and you take the suggestion, that would be one word. And this is the way that Chinese people use computers. And I remember looking at Chinese, before I'd ever gone to China, I remember looking at a Chinese website, but why are there so many links? The page is just inundated with text. And when I went to China, I realized the reason it's inundated with so many links is because it is such a pain in the ass to type that you don't want to type anything, you just want to put everything there on the page for the user, so all they have to do is click on it. Right? It blew my mind. And then when we translated, the other crazy part, we launched AdSense in Arabic and in Hebrew at the same time, again for geopolitical reasons. And looking at a web page from right to left is so different. Just that mirroring, all of a sudden is completely different. So I don't know. I mean, I don't know if those stories have any point aside from that they're a little bit fun, but I think one last story. I spent a lot of time in the user experience lab at Google, and I remember we were working on this product feature called demographic targeting. We were taking data from publishers, which are people who have websites, and we were using that to improve ad targeting. And I had spent hours and hours designing a particular UI for this feature. And we had this UX lab inside of Google. We would recruit people to use the product, and then we watch and see what they do. And it was so aggravating to watch these people. If you've ever done, who has watched somebody use their product in the UX lab? Okay. You're like, what is going on with this person? Just click the red button. And it's really, I think, that's a really good, it's humbling because you're like, what am I doing in my job if I can't even design a UI where somebody can actually do the thing that I want them to do? It's the only thing that there's on screen. And I think it's doubly humbling when you do that, you go to a different country and you watch somebody use your UX in a completely different country. And so it's really difficult to start from first principles when you're designing a product that way, but I think that's probably the best way to do it.
One of the things that we're struggling with now is we have a lot of designs that go left to right. We're like, oh, we have this beautiful path across there. We have these workflows, and now all of a sudden we're like, oh, we got to support all these right to left languages, so none of our designs work, and this is great, and none of us know what to do. So I think that's sort of stressing us to think about more global product managers, having people in market that really deeply understand how all these languages work and how people interact with them, because we're just not, the team here is not capable of doing it because they don't have the experience. So that's definitely stressing our organization right now.
We have the better designs.
We have the designs.
We have the designs.
They're there.
So the other thing, sorry, on topic. The other thing, I worked on Chinese, Japanese, and Korean translation for AdSense, so targeting ads in those different languages. And in those three languages, or at least in Chinese in particular, there are no spaces between the words. And we were using machine learning models to actually probabilistically match. And it was really difficult because the word for turkey, like the animal turkey, in Chinese is fire chicken. Those are the two symbols. So you had like 5 or 6 different of these examples where you could really meaningfully confuse what it is that you were targeting. And so machine learning, if you're doing any kind of probabilistic stuff in different geographies, you really have to pay attention because you can get things horribly wrong.
Chris, anything to add?
No, those were
Well,
great
there's also,
examples.
I'm sure everyone's heard the story about the translation, how it always translates to a man in certain languages, because not all languages have the he, she. So that's also a really interesting thing for all of us to be thinking about as we're going into global markets, is like, are we auto-translating thing to a he? Because there's not always a he at the other end of the interface.
I mean, just the facets of language is, not every word can be perfectly translated to another word, and and also your example of words can get translated wrongly. So like Pinterest, for example, pin in French is not a great word, and that's a problem for our brand. That as we're expanding, that we have to kind of overcome as well. So.
Like the famous Nova.
Yeah.
Cool. So why don't we open it up for the floor for Q&A? Anybody have questions for him?
Thanks for the great discussion. Appreciate it. 2 questions, if I could. There's time for it. The first question is around, we talked about sales and incorporating their feedback. Just curious if you actually have a formal process within the organization that allows for sales or other members of the organization to provide upward feedback.
We do have that in certain parts of my team. So one of the things that I've encouraged anyone on my team that has a revenue generating product is to have some level of product counsel so that they do have a relationship with someone in sales. And again, it's one voice, having some top customers, partners as well. And so anyone who is doing a product counsel does typically have sales involved in that.
And as part of that council, I'm assuming there's representation not only on product, but from sales and maybe marketing.
Support, marketing, UX, engineering, the full discipline.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you. And the other question I'd have for you is any suggestions or recommendations around the approach of a pricing strategy as you're going global? How not only you look at the feature set, but how you price that feature set across different markets?
We definitely have to think about that. And also in context of what's happening with the competitive ecosystem. So are we reacting to something and we have to price accordingly in a way that this market understands? There's just a lot of components that go into the pricing strategy. I feel fortunate because I have someone on my team that does all the pricing strategy, so they'll go in and look at it from all different angles. But yeah, certainly that is a component because we have run into situations where in different markets it's just priced completely differently. Whereas maybe we're doing something database size and they're doing it per seat, so it does kind of make it difficult. It's a good SaaS question.
I think you had your hand up next.
Really interesting conversation. Thank you. Question is in your work. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
In your organizations, how do you handle localization? Is it centralized? Is it within the teams? What is your experience and what do you see as the best practices?
For us, everything is sort of platformatized. So we have even labels that are due every 2 weeks. So we have a doc team that's integrated into our Scrum teams. And so they're responsible for all the labels and they have to create everything in a way that our translation layer can pick it up. And then there's a team that is checking everything to make sure that it's translating exactly the way we expect. But having a doc competency ingrained into the team is one best practice that we have to make sure that we're set up from a platform perspective.
We have time for one more question. Rupa?
Thanks for the great discussion. This is a question for Chris and Tomasz. Both of you have failed at startups before. Can you talk a little bit about?
Many times, yes.
Can you talk a little bit about what you think, why you think you failed at those two efforts?
Because it's hard. I mean, that's the honest question. There's a great deal of competition, and you think you have a great idea, and then you get out there and market, and you realize it isn't. The company that you mentioned from Israel had this wonderful idea, which is to kind of put what's called content distribution networks, CDNs. They're basically big caches. To build usually it takes millions of dollars to build the different data centers you want to have all over the world to do that. And they figured out a way to do that in public clouds and to do it on actually 30 different public clouds. So it's just this marvelous technical idea that didn't work. And it took me, a surprisingly long time to figure that out. And when I did, then the board wasn't very happy, and we had kind of Radon on Tavi the following Monday morning, where I was no longer the CEO. So that would be an example of a failure where it was this like really great technical idea, and I'm kind of a geek, so I like technical ideas. But then when we started really talking to customers about what exactly they needed, and when we started understanding the economics of the cloud world, where caching is fairly expensive if you're renting it from other people, we just realized that there was this just vanishingly small, and they had some real successes. Salesforce was a customer, and Box was a customer, and but we found that they were being used in really, really small scenarios. And so I think you try to pivot as long as you can, and you try and figure out what customers are telling you, and sometimes you get to a point where you just can't pivot anymore. The expression I kind of use for my teams is having a startup is like being in this little village at the bottom of a valley, and there's all sorts of people walking around, and you see this mountain kind of over in the distance, and you think, oh, it'd be so cool to climb that mountain. And sooner or later you put together a little group, and you go up and climb that mountain, and it's really awful and terrible, and somebody gets eaten by an alligator and all this other stuff, but you end up on top of this mountain, and it's this really great feeling, and then you look around and you realize it's just a foothill. And then what you really need to do is go over there. And that's a hugely demoralizing point to be at, because everybody's sad about the guy that got eaten by the alligator, among other things. But it's also, when you're up there on that place, there's nobody else that's up there. You've actually earned this insight and knowledge because you're up there and everybody else is down in the village and still thinks that that's the highest peak. And so to me, that's kind of the essence of entrepreneurship is going with the journey and being able to pivot, but not to pivot kind of in a wild or flailing way, but to try and say, what did we learn in that failure? What information did we gain along the way that we can now use because we know things nobody else knows?
I think we have this expression that we use inside of Redpoint, which is most startups die of suicide, not homicide. It's all self-inflicted wounds. It's not that most startups die because they face incredible competition. It's because there are internal issues that plague that company. And I think the consequence or what's the word I'm looking for here? Well, the observation that you should have given that statement is that the most important thing to have as a founder, I think, is like a self-awareness or an egolessness. Because if you're competing as a startup, your main advantage is speed and focus. And what a lot of founders would like to do, and I include myself in this category, is I want to learn everything about the business because it's my startup. But oftentimes a startup just doesn't have that time. It doesn't have the luxury because either the market is moving, or the competition is moving, or you have a certain window of opportunity. And so I think one of the most important characteristics in a leadership team is the ability to say, I am superb at this one particular feature or this one particular thing, and I need to hire people to help me do the others. And a lot of times what happens within startups is, people become blind to their weaknesses to a certain extent and take too much time in order to hire that expertise, either part-time or on a full-time basis, to help them actually get to the next level.
Thank you.
What a great round of questions, and I definitely want to give it up to the panelists and our moderator, Lisa.